listening to Seminary Dropout, and I'm your host, Shane Blackshear. Somewhere in between seminary and youth camp, it's Seminary Dropout. Let's go. My guest today is Natasha Sistrunk Robinson. She's the author of Mentor for Life, Finding Purpose Through Intentional Discipleship. She's a visionary founder of the nonprofit Leadership Links, Inc. Natasha, thanks for being with me.
Thanks for having me, Shane.
I wanted to tell you this story about a while back. I heard this story on NPR where these researchers had gone and basically found the people who were best in their field. So they found like best surgeons, even athletes and things like that. And they tried to figure out, what made them so great. And the common link that they found with them was that they had always a mentor in their life. And they saw when other people decided that they were too old to have a mentor, these people kept a mentor in their life, and it made all the difference for them. And I just think that that's really pertinent to a lot of the things that you say in the book. And if it's important in life, in different kind of job skills, it must be really important in our spiritual life as well.
Absolutely. I could attest, in my personal life, a lot of the reason that I've done the things that I've done and I'm doing the things that I'm doing now is because of the reality of that truth. Having mentors always in my life and being grateful for that to the point that I'm willing to invest that way in the life of another.
How did you come to believe in mentoring so deeply?
Well, I was being mentored as a child before I knew that's what was happening and taking place. I grew up in a small town in South Carolina, and the people in that town, there's a lot of history. They understood, I think, the African proverb that it takes a village to raise a child. And so I had, coaches and teachers and pastors, family members all speaking into my life with the same level of authority. I come from old school upbringing, if you will, where a neighbor would discipline you for misbehaving in public, and then they'll tell your parents, and then you'll get disciplined again, for that type of behavior. And so all of those things were shaping and forming me at an early age. And I didn't have the language for mentoring to say that's what was happening. But looking back on it, that's certainly what was happening. I was being set up for success because of the adults and the interest that they took in my life. And then when I went to the Naval Academy is a school that graduates leaders. Everyone who graduates from that school has been shaped and formed in such a way. And so mentorship is a very natural part of the leadership development that happens there. So from the time you step onto the campus, you are being mentored by people in various fields, not just in the military, but just everyone, the teachers in the classroom. Some are active duty military, some are not. So you're being shaped all around by people to make you the best officer that you can be. And it's actually built into part of the structure of the student population as well. So by the time you become a sophomore, the expectation is that you have a responsibility to mentor the freshmen. And with every increasing classification, there's increased responsibility. And so that was a natural part of my military training as well. So when I got into the military and into the federal government, those were things and skills for years that I just took with me because it was a natural part of the type of leader that I had become at that point.
You make the point that really inside the church we call mentoring discipleship. So there's not really a difference between a spiritual mentor and discipleship, right? That as far as the terms that you use in the book.
Well, right. The way that I'm defining mentoring in the book is as intentional discipleship. And I'm looking at that when I'm talking about mentoring, specifically about what happens within the context of Christian community and how it is that a Christian exercises their responsibility for influence in the life of another person for the purpose of, either drawing that person person closer to Christ or advancing God's kingdom purposes. And so all those things I have to put disclaimers out there because I don't want to miscommunicate that I'm saying mentoring that happens in the church is automatically discipleship. I don't believe that. But I think when we're intentional about making disciples in the church, we can use that language of mentoring. And I'm careful to articulate that and to define that in the book. Because I just really feel like mentoring is a term that people are more familiar with now. I think even people who attend church regularly, I would challenge folks to ask, what does it mean for you to be a disciple of Christ? And are you intentionally making disciples of Christ? And how do you know? And I would submit, Shane, that a lot of our American, regular churchgoers would not be able to articulate a good response, a biblical response to those questions. And for that reason, I use the mentoring language because I think it's more common language for us that I'm really trying to make a bridge to the biblical context of what Christ has called us to do.
Well, I mean, you outline in the book quite well that mentoring, it makes the church better. And also a lot of the problems that most churches have can be linked to a lack of intentional mentoring, intentional discipleship.
Absolutely. Without a shadow of a doubt. Because when we look at Christ's call to make disciples, and that's the reason for me writing this first part of the book. So the book is broken up into two parts. In the first part, and now let me take one step back. When I initially was writing this book proposal idea, there were people who were saying, write a how-to book. And I made the choice not to do that because I don't really believe that's what we need right now. Nor do I believe that how-to books, particularly with an issue this important, it's really going to convict people to do anything better. This is another list to check, right? And so I'm not about calling people to check more lists and get more boxes. I really want to challenge people to what does it mean to live as a follower of Jesus every day, to live your life on purpose for him, and with the expectation and the understanding and the focus of asking the Lord, what are you doing? How can I join in with that? Because it's only one of me and he created me for a specific purpose and for specific contributions in the world. And the sooner I figure out that, I'm not better or only better for it, but everyone that I touch is better for it. And so I really think when we're talking about mentoring in the church, that piece of getting people to understand what it means to live as a kingdom citizen of God, it's very, very important. And so the 3-tier framework I talk about in mentoring as far as spiritual formation is first knowing and loving God, and then affirming our identity, understanding our identity in Christ. What does that mean and look like? And then finally loving our neighbors as ourselves. And so, that really speaks into the great commandment. Jesus said, love God, love others. And so I think the spiritual formation really happens when we approach discipleship and mentoring in that way. But I think another thing also happens, Shane, and that is we start really equipping, according to Ephesians 4, people to do the work and have that work together for the edifying of the kingdom and the uplifting of the church, so that we are all prepared to go out into the world, according to John 17, and not be in the world. Be in the world, but not of it, so to speak, that cliche. But that's really what Jesus is praying. He's praying to his Father, not that he takes us out of the world, but that we go into the world sanctified by the word of truth, and that we display the goodness and the purpose and the love of God to a world that does not yet know him.
I just think that we have a real discipleship crisis.
Absolutely.
In the country right now. I mean, and I don't want to get political. This is me saying this, not you. But apparently there are a lot of people out there who call themselves Christians who think Donald Trump represents their values right now. And you have to, I sit back and see apparently a large number of Christians who are completely detached from biblical Christianity. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a manifestation of a real discipleship crisis that we have in the church right now.
We definitely have a discipleship crisis. Part of that crisis is is that we have made church, our church is like the way we approach church is the way we approach a mall, for example, right? Like you may, go to the mall, you can go to any number of stores to get any number of things. And then you walk out and you may get something, you may not get something, but you're not necessarily better for it anyway. And so, we have this idea of our church is successful. So we're measuring whether or not the church is a good church by or determining success in the church by how many ministry programs we offer, by how charismatic or likable our pastor is. If he or she preaches a sermon that we enjoy, we feel good about ourselves when we leave on Sunday morning, whether our church is growing and that we just have more numbers. And so, of course, the book of Acts articulates the growth of the church body, the explosion of that. But I think we're looking at something different and we're measuring something different in our American church context. And so that's something, that I really wrestle with early in the book, because I think when we are measuring success in the church by the world's by the world's standard, by American standards, that is really problematic, right? Because when I'm thinking about ministry and I'm thinking about discipleship, the question I think we need to be asking is, well, are lives really being changed? Like, do we really see people that are being transformed into the image of Christ? And what that means is that Christ is perfect and Christ is holy. And I'm not that. No, I'm not that. But every day, am I getting closer to that? When my husband looks at me, can he say, I know you're not the person that you were 4 years ago. And I know I'm hoping I'm not the same person 4 years from now that I am today. And so I think that transformation that we're hoping for, we're longing for, it's not happening in the church because our standards and how we measure success is so off scale. That being said, I want to share, in response to your picture in the political landscape, I will say this. One of the commitments, there are 6 commitments to mentoring that I share in the book, and one of them is a commitment to community. And one of the things one of the chapters, I have a whole chapter about embracing unity in diversity. And so what happens when we are ministering in a space and our personal relationships are in such a way that we are only hanging out with people that look like us, think like us, act like us, vote like us, and our kids go to the same school, then what happens with that? According to, I think about N.T. Wright when I took my seminary class called The Person of Jesus. What happens in that is that we start to create and worship a Jesus that is in our own image and not necessarily a Jesus, the Jesus that is presented in the biblical text. And that is a major spiritual crisis, right? And so I feel like when we have people that are in diverse relationships, in intimate relationships and Christian fellowship, you get to see your blind spots and my blind spots. And one of the reasons I chose to go to Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, there are several reasons, but one of the reasons I chose to go to the Charlotte campus in particular was because one, it was a non-denominational, it's not a non-denominational school. It's a school that is not attached to a particular denomination. And so what happens is you have people from various denominations in attendance. And so I can be in a classroom with people who do not have the same denominational background as I, and I can see why they have come to the conclusions about issues that I did not necessarily agree on, but I understood how they got to their place. And so now I'm not approaching that denomination or that person that's someone who hates Jesus or hates the Bible, they're not really committed to the church. That is someone that I say, this is a sister or brother in Christ. We don't have the same conclusion, but I understand. I've listened well, and I understand how they've gotten to that point. And I can still love that person. I can still remain in fellowship with that person. And so you had that denominational diversity. You have men and women in the classroom together. You had generational diversity, and you had people bringing all kinds of experiences. So you have people that were already pastoring or already leading parachurch ministry or already doing nonprofit work like myself, or some that are all, with stay-at-home moms. And so the richness of that experience is really what encouraged me and caused me to grow in my faith and to have a bigger view. that God is not just in my box and in my little congregation and the people who just put God in a box. I really feel like we not just put ourselves at a disadvantage by having such a small view of who God is, but it really is crippling to our theology, and it really is crippling to how it is we're called to love other people.
Well, I think you hit it right on the head. In addition to, the kind of consumer culture that you spoke to earlier, I think that most churches simply just reflect the culture around it. So you got a church, in the South, and it looks like, a red state. It looks like conservatism. You've got, this church in the big city, and it looks like progressivism, secular progressivism. And very few churches are actually creating their own culture that is uniquely Christian. And I think discipleship's got to have a big part in that.
Absolutely. One of the authors that has had an impact on me is Andy Crouch. And he wrote a book a few years ago called Culture Making. And it's actually one of the things I write about in the chapter about culture, the church and culture. And so he says, there are normally four ways that we approach culture. We can critique it, or we can consume it, or, there's a couple of other ways. But what we're really called to do and to be as Christians is to create. So the way that you transform culture is to create more of it. You take, you create goodness, right? And that goodness can replace what is bad that we see. And so I really think and challenge us as citizens of God's kingdom to think more deeply about what it is God is calling us to create in the world. And really that's a part of being an image bearer of God, right? When we see in Genesis 1 and 2 that the reason God created man initially was to say, well, I have this beautiful garden, there's no one to care for it, right? And so he created man so that man could care for the garden and till the garden, so to speak. And the intention was that Adam and when Eve was brought into fellowship with him as well, that together they would cultivate, that garden, and they would take what God has given them, seed bearing plants and animals, and they would take that and they will make it better. They would, make more of it. And then whatever was created would not be damaging to what the Lord has put in place, but that you would see more of the Lord's beauty and glory as a result of the work that they did.
Well, I've loved the passages that you included from Andy Crouch. They're really complementary to what you were going for. And to an earlier point, I think you were quoting someone else in your life, and they said something to the effect of even weeds can grow. That doesn't mean it's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's my academic advisor and one of my mentors, Dr. Rodney Cooper, in one of our leadership classes. Again, he with this challenge of of measuring out success in America by, in the American church by American standards. He has this statement that he would say, or he said to us, and I didn't forget it, that weeds grow, and that doesn't make, the garden healthy. Weeds grow quickly and they grow in abundance. But what they actually do is that they strangle the beauty of the flowers.
Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between being in a multicultural and pluralistic society and that link to discipleship?
Oh, yeah. It's a challenge. It's a challenge I'm wrestling with nearly every day at this point. My husband and I, we're worshiping in a I'll say a multi-ethnic church right now. We've been in that ministry context for 2 years. I've studied and have paid attention and read research that says, the demographics in America is changing drastically. In the next 20, 25 years, they will not be a majority. I think, you don't have to look hard. Again, if you're not just hanging out with your own people, you don't have to look hard to figure this stuff out. It's very clear. The writing's on the wall, right? America is changing, right? Whether we like it or not, it is changing. And I think it is changing she is changing for the better. And the disheartening thing for me, Shane, is that in this embrace of what I would call unity and diversity, and to me, that's not just a racial ethnic thing. I think it is racial and ethnic thing when you start thinking about um, sociology and stuff like that. But I think, we also, it's other things too. It's about class and social and economics and what we consider biblical justice and what is right for this group over here is wrong for that group over there. And the penalty that this group over here gets is not the same as the penalty that group over there gets for the exact same crime. It's about how we view women. One of the things I do is some advocacy work and education and awareness about anti-human trafficking. And by and large statistics, all across the world, are women and children being abused. And so that says something to me about how we view image bearers that are not white and male and rich, right? And so I just think that there are some organizations and structures that are really leaning in and understanding that the world is changing, the demographics are changing, and the only way we're going to survive, businesses are having this conversation. The only way we're going to survive is if we increase our diversity, because we know that at the end of the day, diversity gets us a better product. Diversity gets us a better marketing plan. It gives us more people to sell stuff to. And our bottom line is that we want to make more money. And so we have corporations, that understand that they must do this, and they are already doing it. We have the military that's been doing it. We have work to do there, but they're doing it by and large. And then, you have different, the government. I mean, they're doing it by and large. Again, we have a lot more work to do, but somehow, I don't know, in the church, in this area where we should be leading, of saying that from the loins of Abraham, God has promised that he will bless all nations. That when we look at the end of the book, there will be people of all tongues and tribes and, and not nations that are worshiping Yahweh, and we will be doing that together. And when we are in our glorious bodies, you will be able to tell the difference between us. And God has done that intentionally. And he believes that it's a good thing. And so I say it as a good thing. And so this understanding, this theological understanding means to me that this is something that the church not only needs to embrace, but we should be in front of. And yet we have people in the world and organizations in the world that don't know what we know and don't have the freedom that we have, leading in an area where we should be leading. And really, I think that's it's disheartening for us, because I believe that God calls us to something greater.
Good word. You said before that, you didn't want to do a how-to book, and you didn't, you laid out your case wonderfully. But you also do give some really practical steps for mentoring. One of the things that stands out in the book is that it's you're not advocating necessarily for one-on-one mentoring, but for group mentoring. Why do you think that's important?
Well, I think one-on-one mentoring is very important. And I've been blessed by that in my own life as well. I think we see biblical representation of that. You have Elijah and Elijah. You have, Moses and Joshua. You have Paul and Timothy and Titus. I mean, Naomi and Ruth. I mean, there are several examples of one-on-one discipleship and one-on-one mentoring working in the Bible. I think what's unique about those, though, and I think what I've seen in my own life, is that God divinely orchestrates those relationships and in those relationships at a specific time for a specific purpose. And so what that means is, there's just no model for me saying, if I'm a discipleship pastor or a small group leader, that I'm going to, ask somebody to fill out a form and I'm going to put some random person with that random person and hope they somehow make a spiritual connection, right? There's just no model for that at all. And that's the main reason why I don't advocate for a one-on-one. Not to say that they're not important, but because I don't believe like some third party can somehow randomly figure that out, right? So that's one reason. The other reason is, Because our culture is so individualistic and so me focused. And I really think part of our being sojourners and strangers in this land is constantly making intentional choices to go against that, because the Bible is an Eastern book, and I think we forget that. And so everything that happens is for the purpose of the betterment of the family, the community. It's a very communal book. And even when you see people rise to leadership, it's for the purpose of bringing a whole group of people along. Like Jesus, when we look at Jesus, well, I'll get to Jesus in a minute, but let's look at Moses, for example. Moses was raised to a place of leadership, but he had a team. Like God gave him Aaron and Moses and her and other people, to help him. And when he didn't do that, his father-in-law called him to account of that. So even the fact that he would listen to his father-in-law correction in that says something about Moses' leadership and his character. But you see them ministering as a team, and it's for the betterment of God's people, Israel at the time. And so I see, even when individuals are raised up in the Bible, it's for a benefit of a larger picture and a larger group of people. So I think that's important. But what we think about when we're saying, me as an individual mentee want a mentor, then what happens in our American context is there's all kind of expectations that comes with that, right? We can want mentoring for a whole bunch of reasons. And one of the things I write about in the book, one of the ladies I asked to mentor me, she, her first question was, well, are you asking me because, is this important to you because you miss your mom, right? Because my mother passed away when I was a sophomore in college.
Right.
This lady was old enough to be my mother. And, I think it's a valid question. And I said to her, no. And I can say that with a great deal of integrity, because one, no one's going to replace my mom. Two, I had a great relationship with my mom. And that's not why I was reaching out to her. But this whole idea that when I come and I ask somebody for something, I'm in it because I want to know what I'm going to get out of it. What's in it for me? Right. And so if that is the way that we approach one-on-one mentoring relationship, I think that is the wrong posture to have when we're talking about mentoring for God's kingdom purpose. So that's the second reason I did not approach a one-on-one mentoring model. Now, the last thing and the most important thing is really the context of mentoring within the context of a small group that I'm sharing in the book is looking at Jesus and his relationship with his 12 disciples. And so we have Jesus mentoring, we have Jesus ministering, we have Jesus, these are his disciples, he is their rabbi, he is their able teacher, and they are learning from him. He's doing life with them. He's, spending quality time. They're relational, he calls them friends. And he called on his friends when he was in need of help. You think about him in the Garden of Gethsemane, that he did not go to that garden, to pray alone. And so, he took his three closest friends, James, Peter, and John, with him, and he asked them to intercede on his behalf. And so this idea that there's something very special that happens within the context of community and within the context of small group, especially when we have churches that are so large, a lot of times in America. But Jesus and his relationship with the 12 is the model that I'm sharing here. And I think the richness that happens there is a lot of challenges that we've talked about before about, having limited relationships and not having diversity. All those things can be addressed when you're mentoring within the context of a small group.
What are some other just practical things that people should consider or know?
Well, I found myself the last couple of weeks really saying and doing a lot of praying, preparing, and planning in that order. I think is important. And so one of the questions that people have been asking me over the last few days as I'm having conversations about the book is, but how do you know when you're ready? Or why, at what point should a person not mentor? And my response has been and is, I believe very strongly, when we're talking about making disciples, which I am, the answer of when is always now. It's always now, whether you feel ready or prepared or not. But I do believe that preparation and training is very important. Equipping the saints and the people of God for the work of God's kingdom is very, very important. And I think about anything else we do in life, we prepare for, by and large. And somehow we feel like in our spiritual lives, we shouldn't put in work. It's a, Dietrich Bonhoeffer would say that's cheap grace. That's a false understanding of grace. That we are saved by grace alone. Yes, we don't have to do anything to become saved. But the evidence that we are saved is what we do, how we respond, to God's call and the work and the things he puts in front of us. And so I think practically praying about who God might have in your life for you to make more intentional investments with is very, very important. I think preparing for that, in what you read. So say your church may not be all that diverse and you may not be having those challenging conversations, but you can read, what you read and what you watch, and what you look at on the internet, preparing it in that way, becoming a student of the Bible, but and a student of the narratives, the stories of the Bible, and also a student of what has happened over church history and what is happening right now. I mean, we are essentially, until Christ returns, we are creating history every day. And so, what is God calling you to right now? Just being more alert, I want to say, Shane, and paying attention. And so I think all of that helps with preparation. Of course, one of my main reasons for writing this book, because it was not on my bucket list of things to do, is to offer a resource. Because there are discipleship books out there, there are leadership books out there, and those are two things, as you can see, that are very passionate on my heart. But I just felt like, because number one, let's be honest, there are not a lot of resources like that from a voice of a woman. They're not. And so I thought that was important, that there's something missing even when a woman's voice is not allowed to speak into a conversation. And so I think this book, my hope and prayer is that this book, not just because it's mine, because one of the things people will know about me if you read my blog is that I'm recommending and reading other people's books all the time. So I'm saying about this book, Mentor for Life, not because it's my book necessarily, but because I think it is a tool that can help prepare people for mentoring specifically from the perspective of intentional discipleship. So take advantage of the tools that are available. I offer some of those tools on my official website that I know you're going to share with your listeners as well, for free. And for those who are actually purchasing the book, what we call an early order, so before the end of March, they can go to my website and put in their information, and we'll send them a leadership training manual, resource tool. So if they want to prepare themselves in their home, it will be a benefit for them. There's a resource manual as well as videos. But if you are, for example, a small group leader or a discipleship pastor or a pastor at a church, and you're saying, I really want to be more intentional, I want to make discipleship a priority in my church, then this is a tool you can use for your leadership team. And so I highly encourage that as well. So the preparation, and that leads to the planning. And the last caveat I would say, though, is that just because you are not quite prepared, I don't know you'll ever really feel ready. As a leader and as a mentor, I'm learning all the time. I've made a commitment to be a lifelong learner. And so I never feel like I've arrived as a leader or I've arrived as a mentor. So not feeling ready is not a reason to using a lot of negatives, but don't feel that I should not start because I'm not yet ready. Because one of the things that will happen is that you will get what we call in the military on-the-job training. It's like being a parent. You can prepare, you can get the room ready, you can have the diapers and the formula and decide whether or not you want to breastfeed and do organic this. And it's a lot of things to get ready to parent. But you don't know anything about parenting when your child comes. And a lot of what you thought you were going to do and all the things, whether you're going to let them cry it out or sleep in your bed, right? Like these are decisions you make in advance. But then when the child comes, at the end of the day, you're like, I just want to sleep.
That's right.
And I'm going to do what's necessary, so I can sleep. And the child is, Lord, if they're healthy and safe, then thank God for another day, right? And so I think parenting is a great example of that we can prepare as best we can. But at the end of the day, a lot of what we learn as mothers and fathers, we learn on the job. And that changes with each child as well. And so mentoring is very much in the same way, that Just because something worked over here doesn't mean it's going to work over there, which is why I did not write a how-to book. But also the way I mentored this person and I approached that relationship and that group and that community and that church may not be the way that I approach it the next time around. And so I have to be open to what God is doing in a space, and I have to be open and yielding to the Holy Spirit and how how He wants to use me in a particular space.
I've interviewed enough authors to understand that a lot of changes get made at the publishing level. Was the choice to write this book for women, was that something that you intended from the beginning, or was that a change that happened later on?
So my intention from the beginning, and I feel very pleased with where we landed. The publishing process for me, as far as editing, I was very encouraged by it. So I didn't feel like a lot of my words were changed or my voice was trying to be changed into something it's not. And so I was very encouraged this time around, being my first time, that I could be authentic and really have my message be what I felt the Lord gave me to say. And so I'm really encouraged by that. I thank Zondervan for that. But my intention, Shane, from day one was to write a book about discipleship that will be a blessing and a gift and a benefit to the church. And so where you would see that some of the examples are shared from a context of a woman's perspective. But I was very intentional that this is not a women's ministry book, and it is not a book for women. I mean, they will probably be the primary audience and readers, but I say that because it's written for the church. And I think men, and you've read it, and I would love your feedback on it, but I think men will get a lot out of reading this book. And the same way I'm required as a regular churchgoer to sit on a Sunday morning and listen to sport analogies, and I don't know anything about sports.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about sports at all. In the same way I'm expected to sit through that and get something out of it, I think men and women in the church, both can really benefit from what is being shared in this book, because I think you will agree that what I'm sharing is very much a biblical message, and it's a message for the whole church, and not just for women.
Well, the reason I asked that is because, for that exact reason, that I worry that people might get that impression, and there's nothing in this book that men cannot get something out of as well. It's not, there's nothing that is only for women. And so I want to encourage everyone, man, woman, to read the book. And then also, there are going to be a lot of people who are listening who don't have a leadership position in the church. They're not a pastor. They're not, a discipleship pastor or something like that. I would go and bring this book to your pastor, to your leader, and investigate the possibility of, helping start one of these ministries in your church. I love what you talk about, Natasha, about just being so intentional and putting the work in. Because I think every church needs to have some kind of formalized discipleship program going on at their church.
Absolutely. I just think, I don't know, somewhere when I was a child, there was just understanding that anything worth having is worth working for.
Yes.
Right. And I don't know where I picked that up, but I know it's something that's deeply ingrained in me. And I know that anything in my life I've done, people like to talk about accolades and stuff. People who know me personally know that I'm not so much interested in titles and accomplishments and all of that. I mean, I like to get things done, but I do the things that I'm very passionate about, and that's why I do them. So people will see, Naval Academy graduate or Gordon Conwell graduate, and the things that I've done, and they'll look at it and like, oh, wow, that's awesome. That's good for her. And they not look at the sacrifice and the work and the time and commitment that's been put into that. And, for every doctor, for every lawyer, for every, teacher, for anyone who's done anything important or of value in this world, they've had to put in work. And so I really am pushing back against this idea that, once we are followers of Christ, that, just thank God for Jesus and I can, just give God my leftovers.
Sit back and relax.
I can give God my leftovers, and I just feel like God is the most important thing to me. And so because of that, that everything else I do overflows out of that. And so I want to encourage people that being present with God and being present in community with other people, and that's one of the mentoring commitments as well, it's worth the effort. It's worth the work, so to speak. And again, we're not talking about working unto salvation. Our salvation is assured, thanks be to Jesus Christ, right? But we're talking about what does it mean to really grow in maturity? The writer of Hebrews, one of the things that's written there is, I'm getting, Natasha's paraphrase, right? I'm really frustrated. I'm getting kind of tired with you all because really you should be teaching by now, and you can't teach because I'm constantly have to teach you the elementary fundamentals of the faith, right? And I'm really tired of that. That's the modern interpretation of that text. And so this idea that I think I reject too that some of us are called to be leaders and some of us are not, particularly in the church. We may all lead in different contexts in different ways. But the very fact that you are a Christ follower means that you are called to a position of leadership in the world, right? So you might as well just own that. Whether you're comfortable with it or not, you need to own that. And I think with that ownership, we need to understand the responsibility of that. And that responsibility does require us, when we're talking about growing in spiritual maturity and living our lives and walking in purpose and having the whole body work and function together. I love Paul's writing in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, when he talks about the hand, can't say to the eye, I have no need of thee, and the, foot or whatever can't say to the ear, I have no need of thee, because all those body parts are necessary, using the body as a metaphor for the church. They're necessary for the church to function properly. So what I don't want in my own body, like one of the things I have, I'm lactose intolerant. So I'm like constantly struggling. I'm calling it a thorn in the flesh at this point. It's just something I have to kind of suffer through in this world, right? That I have stomach problems fairly regularly. And the stomach is a very small muscle, organ, but it has an impact on my entire body. And so this idea that we have people in the body that are not functioning, well, that's their problem. It's not a big deal. Well, that's a huge deal. It's a huge deal for the church, and it's a huge deal for the work that the church is called to influence the world.
Natasha, you had asked me to review it and write a blurb, and I was happy to, and I was honored to after I read it, because I think this is so important. I think this is the kind of thing that is going to solve the discipleship crisis in our church. So, Natasha, thank you, and thanks for talking with me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Shane. I always appreciate you and your work.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Seminary Dropout. Remember, you can find all the show notes for this show and all shows at shaneblackshear.com. Oh, and hey, have you ever thought about starting your very own podcast? I bet you have. And I think you should do it. In fact, I've created a course just for you to teach you everything that I've learned over the last couple of years producing Seminary Dropout. So if you're interested in podcasting and want to learn how, go check out my course. You can go there by typing in podcastingforeveryone.org. And you can get a special discount by typing in the discount code Seminary Dropout, all one word. That'll give you 25% off. So go check it out. If you have any questions, let me know. Okay. Thanks to those that left ratings and reviews on iTunes this week. Remember, that keeps the show front and center. Also, remember, you can find me on Twitter at beardonabike. That's at beardonabike. Also, I'm on Facebook, facebook.com/ShaneBlackshear123. And remember that Seminary Dropout is listener supported. You can visit supportseminarydropout.com and press Become a Patron. Remember, this music you're listening to right now is by D.L. Rossi. You can find him online on iTunes and at dlrossi.com. All right, thanks again for joining me for another episode of Seminary Dropout. Stay tuned for next week's episode. Love you. Take care.